This segment is from the Piano Inspires podcast, Season 2, Episode 13, featuring Jeremy Siskind with host Andrea McAllister.
You know, besides what do I practice, one of the biggest questions we get is like, well, I'm playing the same things again and again, right? My improvisations always sound the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing is like, well, have you've been really sitting with recordings and you know, you don't have to analyze from a harmonic perspective of, oh, he's using the E flat super Locrian scale. That kind of thing's interesting. But there's all this stuff with articulation and shape and rhythm and how one phrase connects to the next one that you could do without being a jazz theory expert. That can get you unstuck and get you can get you inspiration and motivation towards that next thing.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you're talking about your restlessness really helps. You know, I think the restlessness of, oh, well, that was fine, but what are 20 other ways I could do this?
Absolutely.
Has really served you well when it comes to your performing and listening and reflection on what you do.
Yeah, and one of my mentors, I know someone, you know, Tony Caramia, talks about asking what if questions. You know, to play a phrase and ask, what if it was steps instead of it was skips instead of steps? What if it was long notes instead of short notes? And I love integrating that for my students because it just unlocks so many different possible elements. And you know, I think the best improvisers lead with their ear. Right? We can do all the thinking, we could do all the muscle memory work, but you know, we need to lead with our ear. And so if we're not engaged from that oral perspective, nothing else quite works, is my experience.
Well, and I think we can, you know, you're making this bridge to we'll say more traditional piano pedagogy. So if we want to put it under that umbrella, even traditional performers should be asking those what if questions.
Right.
And we should be leading with the ear. So there's so many ways in which the work you do, you know, with all of the materials that you are providing for teachers and students all over, can be applied to so many things, not just I want to learn how to play jazz piano.
Yeah, I think so. You know, there's some people who are like, everybody should learn how to play jazz and improvise. I don't think everybody needs to. I think there's some very successful, fantastic, you know, life-giving classical pianists and musicians who've never touched jazz and don't care for it. But I think more and more people are finding that it's expanding their voice, whether they have the intent to perform, to improvise in a performance or not. I'm sure there's plenty of pianists who would be horrified to improvise in a performance, but maybe are learning that, finding their own voice and, you know, experimenting with what if things went a different way is giving them new appreciation for their repertoire, is giving them new appreciation for the sounds that they're making, and is really enhancing what they do. So it's kind of cool. I think, you know, talking about traditional piano pedagogy, I know for years and years and years, a lot of great pedagogues have fought to put improvisation and composition, you know, in these off-page activities and bring it into this like legitimacy within the piano pedagogy world, even though traditional pedagogues are maybe resistant. You know, I'm thinking of people like Bradley Soash and Forrest Kinney and Tony Caramia and people who have just done so much work to elevate the status. And I feel fortunate to now come in at a moment where we could say, okay, you know, people do mostly accept that improvisation is useful for just about any student. And now I get to say, well, how do we get them to improvise better? Right? Not only, okay, are we going to get them an experience, but we want to actually teach them about how music works through improvisation and get them to be able to execute it. Because that's like the highest level of mastering any theory concept, right? Is to be able to actually create something new. And especially if you can create it spontaneously using that theory concept. So like I find that my duty here in terms of continuing on the legacy of those folks and others is now taking it not just like, okay, let's put our hands on the black keys and let's make something pretty. It's saying like, okay, how can this be better? how can we actually get them making music and playing better melodies and playing with more consciousness and with more variety? And to me, that's where I see my role in this community.
And your restlessness helps with that because there's always variety.
There's always more to do.
Really, I think it's interesting because if you look at the history of the piano repertoire, the composers we know and love were improvisers.
Right.
They didn't have the score and say play everything, note for note. They expected that there would be improvisation. They wrote space for improvisation. And somehow we got away from that, and it all became about, you will play this note perfectly, and that is the score because that is what Bach intended. And yes, we should be able to do that. But somehow we got away from that spirit of improvisation and became very tied to a score. So fortunately for the work of those that you mentioned, Tony Karamia, Forrest Kinney, Bradley Soash, and now you, we're seeing the swing back in the other direction.
Yeah, and I think it's very cool that like historical improvisation is also really making a comeback. And John Mortensen is one of the main people involved with that, who's become a very good friend of mine. And like it feels like there is starting to be a renewed interest, not just in jazz, because that is a particular genre on top of the fact that it's improvised, but on figuring out how do we improvise in the style of a Bach or a Mozart or a Schubert, or how do we improvise our own cadenzas. I've talked to a lot of students who are playing a concerto and figuring out how to improvise their own cadenza. And you referenced earlier this set of pieces, the Perpetual Motion Etudes, that I wrote, which I think are an interesting example. So they're 9 kind of virtuosic piano pieces, and they have versions that can be played by just a classical pianist who's reading the notes. But each one has what I kind of talk about as an off-ramp, where you can go off script and improvise and then kind of return to the written material. And so I play them, and I play the written out material. I improvise in the middle, but I've also, as you referenced, play them as duos with students and with other colleagues. And it's kind of fun to put those out in the world as a newish experiment in where we might be headed in the piano world with improvisation. That it's not necessarily that you need to be a jazz pianist. It's not necessarily that you need to be a strict classical pianist, but maybe we can find different ways to combine these two art forms. So like I think that kind of thing is really fun for me.
Be sure to listen to the full episode on our website, pianoinspires.com, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.